Have you ever wondered why the deepest truths of your spiritual awakening feel impossible to explain, as if language itself collapses the moment you try to give shape to what awakened inside you? It is strange, isn't it, how something so vivid, so undeniable, becomes fragile the instant it is spoken aloud. People often imagine that awakening fills you with a desire to teach, to proclaim, to reveal what you discovered. But the opposite usually happens. The more awake you become, the more you sense that certain inner truths cannot survive exposure to ordinary consciousness without being distorted, diminished, or misunderstood. You feel it when you try to share even a fragment of your experience. Someone listens politely, but their eyes reveal it. They are hearing your words, not your meaning. They interpret your awakening through the lens of their own fears, beliefs, and expectations. And suddenly the truth you lived becomes something else entirely, something smaller, something that no longer carries the essence that transformed you. This is why spiritually awake people learn to hold silence not as secrecy, but as protection. Not because they are superior, but because they understand how easily a sacred insight can be reduced to a casual opinion in the wrong environment. And perhaps you have felt that inner pull too, a quiet voice saying, "Not this, not here, not with them." Because awakening changes not only what you see, but how you see. And most of the world is still wandering inside illusions you no longer inhabit. Have you experienced this tension yourself? Have you felt the subtle isolation that comes from carrying truths that cannot be proclaimed? If you have, share your experience below and let me know how this resonates with you. Leave a like if this reflection is helping you understand your own awakening more deeply, and check whether you are already subscribed so you do not miss the next steps of this journey. And as we continue, notice how each layer of silence reveals a deeper layer of truth, waiting just beneath the surface. When you begin to awaken, something subtle shifts in the way you perceive communication itself. You realize that most conversations are not exchanges of truth, but exchanges of comfort, mutually agreed illusions designed to maintain a sense of normalcy. And this is precisely why certain spiritual perceptions cannot be shared without being immediately reshaped into something they are not. People do not hear what you say. They hear what their current level of awareness allows them to understand. The rest gets filtered out, dismissed, or reinterpreted until it fits the world they already believe in. This is not a flaw in them. It is simply the architecture of human consciousness before awakening. So you start to recognize a quiet danger. When you speak a truth that someone cannot hold, they will mentally break it into pieces small enough to fit their worldview. What was once a living insight inside you becomes flattened into a concept, and that concept is then placed into categories you never intended. Suddenly your inner knowing is perceived as philosophy, speculation, imagination, or in some cases, delusion, and you feel the subtle discomfort of watching something sacred lose its essence the moment it is spoken. Awakening teaches you that depth cannot be forced into a mind not yet prepared to receive it. Just as a seed cannot be planted in frozen soil, spiritual perception cannot root itself in a consciousness still shielded by its own defenses. You begin to see that people protect their illusions with surprising strength, not out of stubbornness, but because those illusions are their familiar ground, the framework that keeps their psychological world intact. To offer a truth that threatens that structure is to ask them to step into uncertainty, and most are not ready for this step. So you learn to hold your perception with a kind of gentle restraint. Not silence born of fear, but silence born of wisdom. You sense that truth has its own timing, its own rhythm, and that awakening cannot be transferred. It can only be recognized when the inner door finally opens. And as that realization settles within you, you begin to understand why those who awaken naturally grow quieter, not because they have less to say, but because they finally see what words cannot carry. As your awakening deepens, you begin to notice an unexpected tension that arises whenever you try to share inner experiences with those who still see the world through the familiar filters of ordinary perception. It is not hostility nor rejection, but a subtle misalignment, like two instruments tuned to different octaves. You speak from a place of expanded awareness, while others listen from a framework shaped by survival, social conditioning, and emotional narratives. And this mismatch creates a distortion that is almost impossible to avoid. What feels clear to you becomes ambiguous to them. What feels transformative to you feels abstract or exaggerated to them. What feels real to you sounds symbolic to them, and this gap cannot be bridged through explanation alone. You begin to perceive that awakening is not merely about gaining insight, but about shifting the entire operating system of your consciousness. The way you interpret emotions, choices, relationships, time, purpose, and even suffering changes dramatically. But to someone who has not undergone this internal restructuring, your perspective may appear detached, idealistic, or overly intense. They cannot imagine the inner landscape you now inhabit because they have not crossed the same threshold. And so the risk emerges. When you speak your truth to someone who cannot perceive its depth, they will unintentionally reduce it to something they can manage. They compress your experience into familiar categories because their minds are not yet open to the dimension you now perceive. This is why the awakened often feel a quiet sense of separation from the world, not loneliness but clarity. You recognize that speaking too openly about your inner shift does not bring understanding. It often brings misunderstanding. And even when people mean well, they respond through the lens of their own fears, beliefs, or expectations. They may question your judgment, doubt your intuition, or interpret your insight as emotional confusion. So you learn to guard your inner truth with discernment, not to hide it forever, but to protect it until it finds the kind of space where it can be met with resonance rather than resistance. And as you sense this more and more, you begin to understand that awakening does not ask you to convince anyone. It only asks you to remain faithful to the reality that has opened within you, even if others cannot yet perceive its shape. There comes a moment in every spiritual awakening when you realize that the very attempt to articulate your inner transformation changes its nature. As soon as you try to translate a profound shift into sentences, something essential evaporates. The words feel too linear for something that did not happen in a straight line. The insight feels too multidimensional for a language designed to describe only the visible. And so when you speak, you sense the truth slipping through the spaces between your phrases, leaving behind only an echo of what truly occurred. This is why the awakened often choose silence over explanation. Not because they are secretive, but because they have learned that the spoken form cannot hold the original depth of the experience. You begin to recognize that the most transformative inner truths arrive without language. They rise like a knowing, a clarity, a sudden shift in perception that needs no interpretation. But once you try to express it, you are forced to place that living insight into rigid structures, selecting words that are too small, too narrow, too constrained. And the more you attempt to refine them, the further you move from the essence of what was revealed. You feel the limitation sharply. You feel the distortion immediately. And this teaches you restraint. Not every truth that arises within you is meant to be carried outward into the world. This awareness does not isolate you. It stabilizes you. It allows you to inhabit your awakening with humility, recognizing that some experiences are not meant to be shared, but lived. Some insights are not meant to be taught, but embodied. Some revelations are not seeds to scatter, but roots to cultivate quietly within yourself. And as you hold this understanding, a deeper maturity begins to form, one that honors both the power of silence and the fragility of spoken truth, allowing you to protect what is still expanding inside you. As awakening unfolds within you, you begin to distinguish something crucial. There is a profound difference between wisdom that is lived and wisdom that is merely spoken. Before awakening, it is easy to believe that understanding comes from collecting ideas, reading philosophies, or absorbing teachings from others. But once consciousness expands, you see that real transformation does not come from information at all. It comes from inner shifts so subtle that they cannot be taught directly. They emerge through experience, through presence, through the gradual dismantling of the unconscious patterns you once believed were your identity. And because this process is intimate and internal, you realize that no explanation can fully transmit it to someone who has not lived it. You start to understand why words often fail between the awakened and the unawakened. A lived truth carries weight, nuance, and resonance that cannot be conveyed through concepts alone. When you speak of it, others hear the idea but not the reality. They perceive the form but not the essence. They try to integrate your insight into their existing worldview, unaware that the insight came from a place beyond the limits of that worldview. This creates a gentle dissonance, a quiet misalignment that cannot be resolved through further explanation. The more you try to clarify, the more the gap widens, because what you are describing is not an idea to be learned, but a state of being to be entered. This realization shifts the way you interact with the world. You become less interested in convincing, explaining, or teaching, and more interested in embodying the truth that has taken root within you. You sense that wisdom expresses itself not through speeches or declarations, but through presence, choices, silence, and the energy you bring into every moment. People may not understand your words, but they feel the authenticity in your way of being. And this becomes the true teaching, the one that does not require proclamation. It is the silent transmission that flows from a consciousness aligned with itself. As this understanding deepens, you begin to let go of the need to articulate the inner movements of your awakening, not out of withdrawal, but because you recognize that the essence of what transformed you is something that can only be lived forward. There is a moment in your awakening when you finally understand why certain inner truths must remain unspoken, not because they are forbidden, but because they lose their purity the moment they are exposed to the collective noise of the world. These 6 inner truths are not secrets in the ordinary sense. They are transformations, happening beneath the surface of your identity, reshaping how you perceive yourself, others, and reality itself. The first truth is the quiet recognition that your inner world has become more real than the external one. You no longer navigate life from reactions but from awareness, and trying to explain this shift to someone still living through emotional turbulence only creates confusion. They imagine withdrawal where there is clarity, distance where there is peace. The second truth is the growing sense that suffering no longer holds the same power over you. You still feel it, but you are no longer ruled by it. This can be easily misunderstood as numbness or denial by those who do not yet see suffering as a teacher. The third truth is the dissolution of the old identity you once defended so fiercely. You watch yourself changing from the inside out, yet the world still expects you to be who you were, not who you are becoming. The fourth truth is the realization that intuition has become your primary form of perception, not logic. This unnerves people who rely on predictable reasoning, because intuition cannot be justified, measured, or proven. The fifth truth is your awakening sense of interconnectedness, the felt awareness that boundaries between you and others are softer than they appear. Trying to explain this often leads to misunderstanding, since many interpret it as emotional dependence or spiritual idealism. And the sixth truth is perhaps the most delicate, the awareness that most people are asleep not because they are ignorant, but because they are afraid. To speak this openly would sound judgmental, yet within awakening it is seen with compassion, not superiority. These 6 truths live inside you like fragile constellations, each one reshaping your perception, while simultaneously asking to be carried in silence. And as they deepen, you sense that their power comes not from being spoken, but from being honored in the quiet space where awakening unfolds. As awakening stabilizes within you, you begin to notice how easily spiritual experiences can be misunderstood when presented in the wrong context. Not because people intend harm, but because most individuals interpret everything through the lens of their own emotional landscape. If you speak about clarity, someone may think you feel superior. If you speak about detachment, someone may assume you are cold. If you speak about inner transformation, someone may imagine you are searching for validation. This is why the awakened learn an essential discipline. Never use their spiritual growth as a badge, a justification, or a tool for recognition. You start to see how delicate the line is between expressing truth and seeking approval. When awakening first touches you, there is often a temptation to share what you have discovered, hoping others will see what you see. But the more deeply you awaken, the more you understand that trying to prove your transformation only weakens it. Authentic spiritual growth does not announce itself. It reveals itself quietly through presence, through clarity, through the calm way you move through situations that once triggered you. If you speak of it too soon or too openly, it attracts interpretations shaped by misunderstanding, envy, or resistance. People respond to what they think you mean, not to what you actually experienced. This is why the awakened eventually stop trying to explain themselves. They realize that awakening is not a performance, not an identity, and not a spiritual achievement to be displayed. It is a shift in perception that becomes self-evident only to those who are ready to perceive it. Those who are not ready will misread it, diminish it, or project their fears onto it. And this does not harm the awakening itself, but it disrupts your peace, pulling you back into the old patterns of self-justification you outgrew long ago. So you begin to move differently. You stop offering explanations that were never asked for. You stop trying to correct others' perceptions. You stop allowing your inner growth to become a topic of debate. Instead, you let your silence speak, because silence cannot be misinterpreted. And your presence becomes the message, subtle yet unmistakable, to those whose eyes are finally opening. As you continue to awaken, another subtle realization begins to surface. Exposing your inner truth to those who are not attuned to its frequency can create consequences you never intended. It is not that people wish to diminish what you have discovered. Rather, they instinctively translate your insights into familiar emotional or psychological frameworks. They may assume your awakening is a phase, an escape, a reaction to stress, or a need for attention. Their interpretations come not from malice but from the limits of their own perception. And each misunderstanding places a small weight on your experience, subtly pulling it back toward the ordinary world you have already begun to outgrow. You start to notice that sharing certain insights creates disruptions rather than clarity. A revelation that arrived in stillness can be met with skepticism. A truth that dissolved years of inner conflict can be met with indifference. A shift in consciousness that changed your entire way of seeing can be reduced to a simple opinion. And in witnessing this, you feel how easily the energy of your awakening becomes entangled in others' projections. The moment you step into explanation, you are stepping into a space where your experience must defend itself, justify itself, or survive the weight of others' doubts. So you learn to listen more and speak less. You realize that silence protects not only your inner truth, but your peace. You begin to understand that the world often responds not to what is real, but to what it is ready to handle. And awakening is rarely something people are ready to handle when it comes from another person. It challenges assumptions, disrupts narratives, and invites a kind of introspection many are not prepared to enter. To share too much is to ask someone to confront parts of themselves they have avoided, and most will resist, consciously or not. This teaches you the value of quiet discernment. You start to observe whether someone is listening with curiosity or with fear, whether they are open or defensive, whether they seek understanding or confirmation of their own beliefs. And gradually, without forcing anything, you begin to speak only where your truth can land without distortion. Not because you are hiding, but because you are honoring the sacredness of what is unfolding within you, allowing it to grow without unnecessary interference. As the awakening process continues to unfold within you, you begin to witness another pattern. The more you attempt to justify or validate your inner transformation to others, the more disconnected you feel from your own truth. This happens because awakening is not meant to be proven. It is meant to be lived. The moment you begin explaining yourself, you shift from presence into performance, from authenticity into self-defense. That subtle shift drains the energy of your awakening because it pulls you back toward a version of yourself that is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. People often ask for explanations, not because they genuinely want to understand your perspective, but because they want reassurance that you are still operating within the rules and expectations of the familiar world. When you express ideas that challenge their understanding of reality, they may respond with doubt, sarcasm, concern, or attempts to rationalize your experience into something they can manage. And each time you respond to that pressure, You feel yourself stepping out of your inner clarity and back into old patterns of justification. The awakened self has no need to convince anyone of anything. It simply is. Awakening invites you to stop arguing for your truth and start aligning with it. It teaches you that the need to be understood was part of your former identity, built upon insecurity, fear of rejection, and the desire for belonging. As these layers dissolve, you begin to see how unnecessary it is to explain your inner world to those who have not yet opened to their own. You recognize that truth does not gain strength through validation. It gains strength through embodiment. Eventually, you notice that the less you try to prove your awakening to others, the more deeply you feel it within yourself. And the more you honor your inner experience without forcing it outward, the more naturally your presence speaks for you. People begin to sense a shift, not through your words, but through your stability, your calm, your clarity. This is the paradox. The more silent you become about your growth, the more undeniable it becomes. And as this understanding takes root, you realize that your awakening does not need an audience. It needs only your commitment to live in alignment with the truth that is quietly reshaping your entire being. As your awakening becomes a stable part of your inner life, you begin to understand that the most powerful transformations rarely announce themselves. They unfold quietly, like a new rhythm beneath your thoughts, guiding you toward choices that feel more aligned, more honest, more attuned to the deeper intelligence within you. You no longer feel the need to defend your intuition, nor to hide it. You also no longer feel compelled to explain your perspective to those who cannot meet you where you now stand. Instead, you move through the world with a sense of grounded clarity, carrying your awakening not as a story to be told, but as a frequency that shapes every moment you inhabit. This integration is not dramatic. It is steady, subtle, and profound. You begin responding to life with a calm that once felt impossible. You sense when to speak and when silence holds more truth. You feel when energy resonates and when it drains you. You notice how your presence influences spaces without effort or intention. And gradually, your awakening stops being something that happened to you and becomes something you are. It weaves itself into your values, your relationships, your decisions, and the way you perceive even the smallest details of existence. People may not understand what changed, but they feel it. You start to realize that protecting your inner truth is not withdrawal. It is wisdom. The world moves quickly, often too quickly to recognize depth, but you no longer move at the world's pace. You move at the pace of awareness, of intuition, of quiet certainty. And this creates a way of living that does not need proclamation, validation, or approval. It simply needs your continued commitment to remain aligned with what is real inside you. And if you have reached this point, if something in this journey has echoed your own experience, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe if you feel these reflections support your path. Leave a comment saying something like, "I stayed until the end, so I know this message reached you deeply." If this content resonates with your awakening, a simple like helps this space grow so we can continue exploring together. And when you are ready, there is another video here that expands these insights even further. Follow that thread and continue this journey at your own pace.